Miderios, it's David McGillivray here, and this is Little Did You Know. It's a chat show in which I talk to people I find interesting. I hope you agree. Now, on August the 20th, there's a film opening in cinemas called Censor, and it's set during the video nasty era of the 1980s. It's an era I remember very well indeed. It was a time when a lot of people, including myself, were copying and swapping videotapes that had become illegal. And one of these people was my friend Mark Morris. He was a member of this subversive secret society, and he told me that the person I needed to sub-edit my book Doing Rude Things, which came out in 1992, was a friend of his. Sure enough, he did a marvellous job. If you were to read that book today, you'd find very few mistakes in it indeed, and it's all because of him. He's one of my favourite writers, and I feel that he has now reached a pinnacle of his art with his blog The Reprobate, and it has a strapline: difficult ideas for difficult times. We're going to be talking a lot about The Reprobate in part 2 of this show, but right now will you please say hello to its author, the very wonderful David Flint.
Hello, nice to be here.
Hello Dave, it's nice to be here in, it's not the tropics, it's a square in Notting Hill in London. Who would have thought? Now, Dave, sometimes I interview you, sometimes you interview me. Which do you prefer?
I think today we should just have a little chat and see how it all goes.
See how you feel later?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Now, recently, you interviewed me for a top secret project. Terribly exciting. How much can we say about that without getting ourselves into trouble?
Not a lot. We can say that it's being made as a Blu-ray extra, probably for Severin Films. We're interviewing lots of interesting people from the 1970s, and it's specifically about one person in particular, but we can't say who just yet.
We can't say who, but we probably can say that he's one of the most notorious people in the film industry.
One of them, obviously I'm next to one of the others.
And I'm next to another of them. That's enough of that. Let's go back in time to the 1980s. I want to remind you of something you wrote, and that is that you are a full-time angry misanthrope.
Yeah.
Something I just cannot concur with, in all honesty. But tell me, what was making you angry in the 1980s, and is it the same stuff that's making you angry today?
It's very much the same stuff. It's all to do with censorship and the kind of wider free speech issues and ideas of free expression. So today I've been getting wound up about the idea of internet anonymity, or shall we say social media anonymity, where, you know, in theory it sounds like a great idea, but in practice, you know, there are lots of reasons why people need to be anonymous online, and that includes not giving their details to a company that might then be hacked and leak them, as we've seen with everything from Ashley Madison to LinkedIn. So, you know, I think the idea that people are using particular moments of abuse to push their own agenda is very much what we had in the 1980s with video nasties, what we've seen with everything that there's a censorship call for. People climb on bandwagons, they exploit it, and they push the public agenda. So, yeah, the same thing really.
Let's move back now to the 80s for the benefit of those who don't remember that era. What was it like living through the so-called video nasties scandal?
Well, you know, I do say to some people who have that kind of 80s nostalgia that, you know, some of us lived through that time, so you don't have to. And it was shocking, because I think, you know, I was 14 when I first started renting movies. watched a lot of horror films that I'd never heard of before, a lot of horror films that I had heard of before, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that you couldn't get in this country. And then suddenly, this massive campaign pops up out of nowhere. But again, very coordinated it seemed, because one person writes about it, and then another, and then another, and then another, so it just goes on very quickly. Mass hysteria happens, and you're, as somebody who's watching that stuff, there's suddenly this awareness that's like, hang on a minute, first of all, what they said about these films isn't true. Secondly, this is deeply unfair, because this is the stuff I really like, and now it's going to be taken away from me.
These were difficult times as well, weren't they? In fact, I believe I'm right in saying that you had a couple of run-ins with PC Plod.
I did, actually one with the police, one with the customs. So I ran the gamut of authoritarian people.
I mentioned earlier this film called Censor. You haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it.
Nor have I. The reviews so far haven't been that good.
They seem to be mixed.
What I'm wondering is that, will they get the mood, the atmosphere right, because the film's made by people who are who were too young at the time.
I think, I've seen that, obviously, I'm guessing in coordination with the film being released, that people have been writing about this again online, and certainly in America you see that they get the flavour of it, but the details are all wrong. So you're having cinemas doing seasons of video nasties that include things like David Cronenberg movies, which of course were never video nasties. In the grand scheme of things, probably doesn't matter, but for those of us who were there, it's just that little need, it's that niggling little thing that you think, I want them to be right. How hard is it just to put in the right films rather than the wrong ones?
Will you see it?
I imagine I'll see it at some point. Yes.
I probably will, yes.
Yeah, I know a few people involved in that, as do you, so it seems impolite not to.
Kim Newman is one of them.
Yes.
I wonder what he did on that film. He's been our guest on this show.
Is he executive producer or
He
producer?
is, yes.
Yeah, I know he had. Yeah, I couldn't decide whether he was an actual producer or executive producer. Seems to be one of those things where your role can be variable.
Indeed. Dave, I want to talk about just some of your magazines and books, and we'd need a much longer program to talk about all of them. So I want to mention a couple that don't turn up in many of your CVs. Let's start with something called Sexadelic. Now, did I dream this, or did I actually write you a couple of articles? What was it?
You did write. You wrote one, or I think you wrote a couple of reviews, and you wrote an article about censorship, probably. I seem to recall enemas were involved.
Possibly, and Mary Millington. We were a bit obsessed with her in those days.
Yeah, this was an idea that I had around 1997 that I thought, let's do this thing, because there was this whole kind of new wave of glossy, expensive porn being made, and I thought this is a really interesting thing that's going on, because there'd been nothing since the end of since the early 80s, I guess. So it was really interesting, and I wanted to celebrate that and write about it and do it in a kind of really interesting and serious way, rather than the usual kind of porn mag sniggering. It was a bit of a disaster in various ways. Initially I was trying to get financing for it from various people, and that came and went and fell through, so I had to do it all myself in the end. So it was much smaller scale than I'd planned. Didn't sell hugely well, and of course I was at the mercy of a particularly, I probably shouldn't name names, but a particularly notorious magazine distributor of the era, who dealt with small movie magazines, and would quite simply said, I'll pay you when you have the second issue ready. But of course I couldn't have the second issue ready until he paid for the first one, so that all fell apart after the first issue. So it was very much a one-off
A short run, but another of your magazines that lasted a bit longer and did have, I believe, a much wider reach was something called Divinity. Now,
Yes.
what's the concept?
That's an interesting question. Divinity, I guess, was supposed to just be what we called transgressive culture in the early 90s.
Huh.
So a little bit underground, a little bit subversive. So if you imagine like a kind of 60s underground into the 90s, so fetish clubs, indie movies, you know, weird sex, strange publications. So, you know, nothing, I didn't want it to be anything that you would be able to just pin down. I wanted it to be, you know, one of those things that you could do anything you wanted with. But it developed its own area. So, you know, we'd be covering people like Lydia Lunch and Richard Kern and all that kind of thing. They became our main figures of interest, I suppose.
You had more success with this. It's a title that's still associated with you, isn't it?
Yeah, that sold, you know, at its peak. It sold quite well. It was well distributed. It was, for what it's worth, it was supposedly the best-selling underground magazine, which, you know, I suppose is a bit like saying, you know, which is the biggest turd in the toilet or something. Yes. You know, it's not that spectacular in terms of sales, but it did well enough. You know, it collapsed in the end after a couple of years due to my own overreach as much as anything else. You know, I got a little bit carried away, both in terms of cover pricing and size. You know, you increase the page numbers, it was a really weird thing, because I put the price up from £3 to £4.50 at one point, and that didn't affect anything, and then it went up from £4.50 to £5, and that really seemed to bite into the sales.
That extra 50p did all the damage?
Weirdly, yeah. And you know, and it was becoming harder and harder. You know, the page count went up, and it was becoming harder and harder to actually fill up with content. A few people moved on, as people do. I think, you know, as you probably know, tracking people down who were once at one point, you know, at the centre of a scene, and then just disappear without trace, and that was already happening at that point.
Are you learning as you go, Dave, with these magazines?
Not remotely.
No, we don't, do we?
I think what I've learned more recently is that the magazine market is now much harder. You know, I did magazines a few years ago, and it's just very difficult. Just getting them into shops. The distribution outlets are not there anymore. You can't put stuff in record shops in the way you used to. So books are the future, I think. That's what I've learned. But even then, with books, it's still a very hard sell.
We ought to mention one more magazine because, and I quote, "It was the most controversial and infamous British fanzine of the 1980s. You know what I'm talking about.
I do. Would that be Sheer Filth?
It's Sheer Filth. Is that a fair description, Dave?
Probably, yes. So it's certainly controversial in my house. My mother was most appalled that that, you know, I'd gone into publication, but she couldn't possibly tell anybody what the publication was called. And I used to get mail addressed to all sorts of things, you know, Sheer Film, Sheer Flint.
Oh, of course.
So
it lasted a bit longer, didn't it?
That kind of went on for a few years. I mean, it was fanzine, so you could just do it whenever you felt like it, really. It was very cheap and very easy.
I think some of the issues have been collected together in a book.
Yes, we did a book a few years ago with Fab Press, Harvey Fenton. Initially, I was looking at just putting something together myself, and then Harvey got wind of it and showed interest, and I knew that Harvey would do a much better job, so went in with him. And I really enjoy what he did with the book. We had a very nice launch party for it. It seems to have sold okay, so I can't complain.
Sheer Filth lives on. Time to get down to again just some of your books, Dave, and one of them I've got right here. there it is. It's Babylon Blue. Now, you say in your preface that it's the first book about the adult movie business, but this book came out in 1998,
Yes.
decades after the golden era of the porn industry. So is that really true?
No, it's a complete
it
lie.
was. Oh, it's a lie. Oh, okay.
It felt like, I think it was the first book to do something or other, but I forget what now. It's a long time ago. But, you know, the first one of the 1990s. There was a whole bunch of them that came out around the same time, as it turns out.
That often happens.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's that thing. It was in the air at the time. The porn industry was actually quite fashionable for a little while in the late 90s. People forget that now. It was actually, you know, very cool. And so lots of people wanted to make TV documentaries about it. Lots of people wanted to make movies. Like, obviously, Boogie Nights and the Larry Flint film. Lots of books. It didn't last, obviously, because, you know, times move on. Now, of course, it's completely demonized again.
Yeah, so what was your take on the porn industry in the late 90s, briefly?
I think by the late 90s, I mean, ironically, by the time that book came out, I think it was already starting to go a little bit into decline again. But what I found interesting was in the mid-90s, there was this move again towards shooting on 35mm film rather than video. There was ambition. People were actually doing stuff that had good, powerful narratives. They were doing stuff with interesting special effects that, of course, look incredibly dated now, but at the time were fairly cutting edge. I just thought this is really interesting because it feels like there's some kind of revolution going on, and also it seemed to fit in with a changing sexual mores of the era. You know, it definitely felt like it was part of that whole thing, that with the explosion of fetish clubs and stuff like that. So I thought, yeah, this is something that's really fascinating. So I kind of went, you know, full on into it for a good few years in terms of researching that stuff. And of course, there was still all the trashy stuff, but even the trashy stuff, you know, you could think this is, you know, there's elements of interest in that. There's elements of interest in, you know, the Buckmans and the Bendovers and things like that. That they're kind of reinventing the way cinema exists. Obviously, it's not cinema; it's video. But you know what I mean.
I do. This is an impossible question, Dave. But what's the best porn film ever made?
Best? I don't know. I mean, my favourite probably still remains Lassie Brown's Sensations from 1975. It's hugely ambitious. It's not a particularly, you know, ambitious in the sense of plot or anything. You know, it's a fairly straightforward story. But you know, he's obviously out there trying to not just make a real film, but he's trying to make a porn film that is a porn film for the ages in a way. You know, he's trying to do something that is ultra sexy, ultra spectacular. I mean, I love the music. I love the whole style of that film. I mean, I always do think it was the first one I ever saw. Does that kind of, you know, tip the balance a little bit, which it might do. But, you know, I still think it stands up really well. I watched it again a few years ago, and I feel, yeah, I think it's still good.
It's probably going to be online somewhere, isn't it? In fact, you're the man who's going to be able to tell us where we can watch Lassie Brown's Sensations.
I don't know if I mean, it probably is. There's a good chance that it's on something like X-Hamster, I would think. Because the DVD that came out is actually cut. Because, you know, there's a scene where a woman pisses on a guy, and that wasn't acceptable at that point within mainstream. And that's the weird thing, you know, there's the mainstream porn labels, and then there's the ones that would just not care about the law and do anything.
We're coming up for a break, Dave, so I have to speed you on to another of your books. It's 10 Years of Terror. Can you just tell us which of those 10 years you're writing about?
That's 1970 to 1979, so a whole decade, unless you're being a pedant, in which case it's a bit of the last decade and some more of the next one.
And what appeals to you about this decade?
I'm a big fan of 70s horror. I think 70s horror is when it became edgier, became darker. You know, the 60s was still quite censored, and the 80s became very mainstream. So the 70s just felt like this renegade decade, not just for horror, but for everything, I think. You know, you look at the movies that came out in that decade, it's an aggressive, angry decade. As you know, you were there making some of these appalling films.
I'm proud to say, yes. This is a bit of a tome. It's so heavy that I couldn't bring it with me.
It's a whopper, yeah.
It's a huge one. But do you know what it's changing hands for now?
The last time I looked, it was 250 to 300.
Oh, for sure. So I can tell you now that a new copy is being offered for £513.42.
Woof.
Does it make you proud?
It makes me think that I should sell one of my copies.
Yes. Mind you, who's paying that sort of money for 10 Years of Terror? We don't know.
Well, these are the questions, aren't they? I mean, what somebody asks for it and what somebody actually sells it for is two different things.
Two different things. Oh, we've only got a moment to mention another book which is light enough for me to carry, and I want to give that a plug. My fingers over the title. How stupid is that? That's called Satan Superstar. There's the strapline. It'll tell you what it's about. I love this book because I learned so much from it. It's about the devil and all his works, most of which, it turned out, I didn't know anything about.
It's an interesting world, yeah. I wanted to make it very pop culture, not some kind of satanic panic book, and that's all been done to death. But yeah, I quite enjoyed that one, and we should do something like that again.
Well, I'm plugging it because I want people to buy a copy. Trust me, it won't be just me who learns something about Satan from that book. I'll just hold it up next to me again while I tell you that we're now going to take a break to have a look at a trailer for a Peccadillo release. This one's very appropriate because it's about a real-life porn star, and it's called Jonathan Agassi Saved My Life. Have a look at this, and then please join us again in a couple of minutes.
שם המשפחה המקורי הוא לנגר, זה לא עבד בשבילי לנגר. אגסי. That's the name.
Jonathan Agassi is here, by the way. I just got here. I'm sorry, I was late.
The best American film performer 2000.
Jonathan became the star of an incredibly successful production in gay porn history.
פעם רשמתי סטטוס, Jonathan Agassi saved my life. הוא מבחינתי דמות שמתי שאני צריך משתלטת עליי ועוזרת לי. הוא תמיד לטובתי.
יונתן? יונתן?
הבן אדם הזה נטש אותנו אחרי שנולדתי. אבל כשהייתי בן 11 וחצי, אז אני זוכר שהוא אמר לי, אתה מתנהג כמו הומו. אין לך קצת מצפון? יש לי הרבה מצפון. אני הגבר שלך.
אתה הגבר שלי, אבל אתה גם הילד שלי. זה יפה, זה יפה. זה יפה, זה מדהים.
אני אוהב אותך, אמא. אני יכול לך לדעת שאת לא גומרת את החודש ולחכות לי עוד נעליים?
אני לא רוצה שתרגיש, כל מה שאף אחד לא נותן, זה עליך.
אבל זה עליי. כבר שנתיים אומר קליינטים. אני נוסע עם קליינט לזה, נוסע עם קליינט לזה. מה, אני עורך דין? אני חשבתי שאת מבינה. אני נורא לא רוצה לחזב אנשים. בן אדם שנכנס עם ג'ונתן אגסי למיטה, מצפה להיכנס למיטה עם אלוהים. אנשים משלמים לי בשביל לישון איתי בלילה, אין בעיה, אני אנצל את זה ואני אגיד להם שיחבקו אותי גם.
10 times he broke you, 10 times you forgave.
פעם היה איזה מישהו שהוא אמר שאני מרלים מול ראש של העולם הזה. אז כאילו הלוואי שזה יסתיים ככה, שכולם רואים אותה כהגדה.
Unable to change.
That's Jonathan Agassi Saved My Life. That's a Peccadillo release. It's about the dark side of the porn industry, and this is something we don't always approve of, isn't it, Dave?
I think Yeah, I think there's that instinctive idea to just be a bit annoyed when people make films about the dark side of the industry, because they don't seem to make them about the other side that often. But of course, you know, there are two sides to every story. So,
Well, this is a documentary about a real life porn star who really did go through the mill. Mostly, it has to be said, it was his own fault, but he came through it. And in fact, he's now working in a supermarket. There you go. And it's on peccadillopod.com. Dave, we don't know much about your early life. There's not.
well, I do.
You do, and I hope you're going to share even more now. There's nothing much online apart from a reference to Offerton High School. Where's that?
That's in Stockport, and Stockport is just about 6 miles south of Manchester,
Where you grew up.
where I grew up.
I'm told you wanted to be a writer from the age of 8.
Possibly even before.
Yes?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I just enjoyed it. It's just the one thing I enjoyed doing while I was at school, to be honest. It's the only thing I felt that I was kind of good at.
Were you good at what was called in those days composition? I wonder if that still exists. This was writing stories.
Yeah. I suppose by the standards of that age, I probably was, but I could never really keep that up. My problem with any kind of fictional stuff is that I rush through it. So, you know, my story is finished by the time I've got to about 4 or 5 pages.
You said earlier in the first part of the program that you were influenced by TV. I think you're one of the many guests on this show who watched late night films, mostly Hammer films.
Yeah, I think the first horror film I remember seeing on TV was Dracula Prince of Darkness, and I kind of begged my parents to let me stay up and watch that. And then
They let you?
Yeah, they let me in the end. And just to prove the shocking influence of these films, the next day, myself and a few friends who'd also seen it went out and reenacted the film several times, taking turns to be Dracula.
This happened with Kim Newman as well. This is absolutely fascinating. So what was it about that film? You can probably remember every frame that appealed to you.
Well, I think just the fact that it was a horror film at that point, just the fact that it was Dracula. I mean, people don't really get now, I think, how much those classic monsters were ingrained in our consciousness at that point. I mean, Dracula was just everything, you know, it's like an obsession. So you knew of Dracula, and you knew him through Christopher Lee, definitely not through Bela Lugosi. I think, you know, if you were English in the 1970s or late 60s, you knew Dracula as Christopher Lee.
Did he scare you?
No. None of that stuff ever did. That's the weird thing.
So what was it then about it that left its mark?
I couldn't really pin down one particular thing that it was. I just think that it looked fantastic. He was this amazing character. It was exciting. I mean, those early Hammer films did have great set pieces, great action set pieces, and that movie opened up with the end of the previous Hammer Dracula. So straight away there's this amazing, you know, chase and fight scene, and then at the end you've got this fantastic scene with Dracula where he stood on the ice and the monkey's shooting the ice away. You know, always a weird thing with Hammer that they seem to want to kill off Dracula in the most obscure ways rather than any kind of traditional vampire way.
Yes, making it all the more difficult to resurrect him.
Yeah.
Well, this is my chance to plug a forthcoming episode of Little Did You Know, because I'll be talking to author Tony Dalton, who's he's written a biography of Terence Fisher, who directed a lot of those Hammer films. We talked earlier in the first part of the show, Dave, about your books and magazines, but when you first became a writer, you were writing for what used to be known in those days as top shelf magazines.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of went from, I started writing for a couple of fanzines, then I did Sheer Filth, and then I moved on to doing stuff for top shelf magazines like Knave, Fiesta. Was it Fiesta?
I
can't
think
recall.
so.
Possibly Fiesta at some point. Men's World, Just 18 Ravers, all the classy titles.
Were you by now meeting porn stars?
Probably not
Oh.
that much at that point.
Oh.
I think because I wasn't down in the offices. I wasn't down in Paul Raymond's offices in Soho or anything like that. So I was still way up in the sticks.
Did you meet him?
No,
Never.
never,
Oh.
never. I mean, I did meet the Guccione
Oh.
very briefly when Penthouse tried to relaunch itself as a mid-shelf magazine.
What was he like?
He was very kind of, I don't know. I mean, just seemed very ordinary, I think.
Often the way.
But he was being immediately shunted off
Yes.
to a private room where the hoi polloi couldn't hang out with him.
I
So
bet.
so it was literally just a kind of, hello, I write for your magazine.
Oh. We've got to move on to the Reprobate because I want to. It's your magnum opus. It's very wide-ranging indeed. I think you would say that essentially it's. I think you mentioned this earlier. It's about individual freedom, or what we would now call plurality.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's kind of mixed between obscure pop culture and shouty rants about censorship. I think that's the main main two parts
and much more as well. I'm guessing that you don't like no platforming or the current business of causing offence. Those are issues with you, aren't they?
They are. I mean, I've not really gone into the whole thing of no platforming yet.
Not
I
yet?
think it's not. I've probably discussed it briefly. There was a certain aspect of various comedians and claiming they've been no platformed when they potentially hadn't. Stories of that kind of thing as well, that people take advantage
That's interesting.
of it.
My earlier guest Robin Ince said that there was very little evidence of comedians being no platformed, but of course famously Jermaine Greer has been.
Yeah, I think it is more
Academics.
It is more academics because they're the people that are doing more talking. I think it's very much a university thing, I think, the no platforming side of things. Otherwise, people can always find a place to do their thing, unless they've done, I forget his name now, but basically the comedian who's just had his entire tour cancelled because he's a racist.
It just happened yesterday. He tweeted about black footballers. And yes, I can't remember his name either, and perhaps that's for the best, really.
Yes,
we don't want to give him any publicity.
But I think he's an exception. Generally speaking, people might not be invited to certain events, but by and large, there are other events that will have them.
True.
I mean, I think things like cancel culture are quite interesting because obviously there is the attempt at shutting people down and stopping them saying things. The thing is, it works both ways. People always think that it's the left trying to shut down the right. But of course, the minute somebody upsets anybody on the right, they try and shut them down as well. So it's...
Now, I want to talk about politics, Dave, because you claim that the Reprobate is neither left nor right nor centre. So how can that possibly be?
Well, we probably are sort of centre, but the problem is that centrism has this kind of bad reputation, and it's either it's seen as wishy-washy, or some people see it as just an excuse that people use for being right-wing when they're not really right-wing. So I don't like to use the term, but I guess we are kind of in the middle. Like, I do read back some of the stuff I've done and think that it starts off very vitriolic, and by the time I've got to the end, it's quite conciliatory.
I see what you mean. Now, you are nothing at the moment, if not prolific, Dave. How many pieces on average are you writing every week for the Reprobate?
I'm trying to do at least one post a day.
One a day?
I don't write all of them now, thankfully, but I write most of them. You know, it's always nice when I can find another writer who will step in and do a little bit of stuff, but it's quite hard keeping them. I mean, obviously, you know, we don't make any money, so we don't pay anybody anything, so it's all voluntary.
Where are you getting all your ideas from?
Well, sometimes I'm just sitting there racking my brain.
Really?
Sometimes it gets to that stage where you're thinking, I really should put something up. Luckily, I do have a stack of film reviews that I can access to put up if I need to. But the problem with that is that I really don't want it to be a film site. So if I do too many, one on top of the other, then I start getting a bit paranoid about that.
Well, let me tell you, Dave, that as I said before, I have learnt so much from the Reprobate. It is very wide-ranging indeed. It covers so many different topics. The only way, for those who haven't seen it, to give you an idea of what it's about is for Dave to just discuss some of just a fraction, one a day, of his pieces. But I mean, what astonishes me is that so many of your pieces are surprising new stuff I knew nothing about. I have to go and research it. I'm terribly impressed.
Well, thank you very much.
Let's just talk about a few. We're only going to have time to discuss half a dozen pieces that have been written for the Reprobate, and I've chosen them in order to give people an idea about how far you do push the envelope in all kinds of different directions. So I'm going to say something, and probably you'll remember
remember writing it.
Remember writing it, exactly. So what would you say if I said the title International Guerrillas?
Oh, yes. This is the film that was made in Pakistan where Salman Rushdie is reinvented as some kind of international mastermind, a bit like you know, what's the guy from the Bond films?
Blofeld.
Blofeld, yeah. So, you know, he runs this international cartel which is trying to destroy Islam in order to open up brothels and casinos around the world.
And you're interested in this film, I know, because it was a very interesting example of censorship.
It was banned in the UK very briefly because the BBC at that time thought that it was libelous, which it technically is libelous, obviously, to Salman Rushdie. You know, he's not an international supervillain. And he said that he wouldn't sue because obviously that would be a ridiculous thing for him to do. You know, not only because of his belief in freedom of speech, but also because it would just publicise the film more, as was it being banned. So the BBC then passed it. Everybody lost interest immediately. The film just did what it would have done, which is like sit in little Pakistani newsagents and places like that, not seen by anybody else.
Although it's something like 3 hours long, I have to say that you ought to have a look at just a bit of it. It is on YouTube. It's a terrible VHS copy, but I have to say, this is something you didn't mention, Dave. I think it's very well directed.
It's so hard to tell because of the poor quality of the copies, and I've got to admit that those movies where they have song and dance numbers every few minutes, it's not for me.
Doesn't do anything for you?
No.
Different strokes for different folks. I'm going to ask how you managed to find out about two names from yesteryear who worked together once: Delia Derbyshire and Anthony Newley.
That's just one of those things that pops up. I mean, sometimes you can be looking for something and something else pops up, and that, I think the Delia Derbyshire documentary had just been on the TV, and I was doing a little bit of research, and then this cover popped up on, and I thought, what's that? That's kind of interesting. And it was this single that Delia Derbyshire and Anthony Newley basically did together. It's a very weird oddball track.
They're an odd couple.
They're an odd couple. I mean, they've both done odd things separately,
Yes.
so together, yeah.
So Delia was, of course, a pioneer of electronic music. Anthony Newley, how can we begin to describe him?
It's hard to say. I mean, he used to be married to Joan Collins. That's the thing that people keep saying whenever I see his name mentioned. It's like,
Yes.
you know, Mr. Joan Collins. But, you know, he went from being, you know, he was a crooner, a pop singer, did wildly eccentric. He was an actor, obviously. He did an album with Fiona Richmond, who was Britain's biggest sex symbol of the 1970s before Mary Millington came along.
We don't produce men like him anymore.
We don't.
It
sadly.
seems, yes. It's on. If you go to Reprobate, there's a link there to this remarkable song, which I believe was never released.
It's been released now.
It had.
It's actually been released by Trunk Records.
Johnny
subsequently.
Trunk.
Johnny Trunk. has
God
released
bless
it.
him. Yeah.
He lives just around the corner.
Does he really?
I believe so.
Well. Here's one of my favourites, Dave, because I've completely forgotten about it. It's about the dark side, but it's about the dark side of Live Aid, and it's Led Zeppelin's performance. Try to describe it for us.
Well, if you imagine a band who were, I think we can safely say that at least one or two of them were probably a little bit overly refreshed at the time. They hadn't played together for 5 years. Jimmy Page, by his own admission, had probably not picked up a guitar for about 3 years. They're suddenly shunted onto Live Aid to do this reunion. Phil Collins flies over because there was this great gimmick that Phil Collins would play in London, and then he'd fly to Philadelphia on Concorde and play there. And, you know, God bless him, you know, it's not actually his fault, but you can see that he doesn't really know the songs. But there's another drummer as well who is just flailing away like crazy. And at some point, if you watch the video clip, you'll see Phil Collins, he essentially just gives up and sits there and just starts going like this because, you know, there's no point. The music is a complete mess. The sound is terrible. Robert Plant's voice is gone. It's just shocking.
But everyone, most people have forgotten how bad that was.
You know, I think I saw it when it was actually broadcast, and I didn't realise how bad it was.
This is it.
I think there was that thing that people looked at it through these rose-tinted lenses at the time because, it's Led Zeppelin back together again.
Yes.
And it's only afterwards, you know, the band clearly knew how shocking it was because they won't allow it to be shown.
Except that we can see it now.
Yes.
There's a link on the Reprobate, isn't there?
There is.
Thank you, Dave. How about this one? Still on the subject of music, but very different music. It's an X Factor type pause. I love doing that. Julie's 16th birthday.
Oh, Julie's 16th birthday. Well, Julie's 16th birthday is a country record, which is one of those death discs, essentially, where it's like a little moral story. So, you know, I think memory serves that the father stays at the bar too long when it's his daughter's 16th birthday, and then he crashes his car on the way home, and it turns out that he's killed his daughter while drunk driving. I think that's the story.
Close.
Yeah, something along those lines anyway.
But the album cover is very special, isn't it?
The album cover is just, basically it's just this man looking deeply into the eyes of this depressed looking girl in a very seedy looking bar. And between that and the title, it's very easy for people to misunderstand what that album is about.
Oh yes.
It's one of those terrible kind of, you know, there's a lot of religious albums that have that feel to them as well. And this is one of those things where you look at it and you just think, yeah, has Julie turned 16 and now she has to marry this terrible old man or something?
And remarkably, nobody thought that through at the time, it seems. It is on the list of the worst LP covers ever produced.
I mean, the artist, whose name I forget at the moment.
Me too.
Apparently did hate the cover from day one, but he was under the control of a manager who thought it would be great for some peculiar reason.
Well, we've all been manipulated in our time, Dave.
Yes.
Let's talk about a TV channel everybody has forgotten about. You know what I'm going to say, don't you?
HVC.
HVC. What on earth was it? Did you ever see it?
All the time.
All the time. Why?
Well, you know, why wouldn't you? I think it was hyped as being the horror and violence channel. That's not what it stood as. HVC was home video channel, but essentially they would just show really cheap, low-budget movies, sex films, action films, horror films, but they had no quality control, no censorship control either. They would show things that the BBC had refused certificates to.
How did they get away with it?
Because nobody watched it.
Oh, except you.
Except there was probably a handful of people, because the other thing that they did was, rather than actually broadcast through satellites, because it was cable, they would send out stacks of tapes to various local cable suppliers, and then somebody would be responsible for putting each tape in and playing it, which of course they didn't always do, or something went wrong. Sometimes you'd see the same film twice in a row. Sometimes they'd be in the wrong order. Sometimes there'd be no film, sometimes there'd be no sound, sometimes there'd be sound but no picture. It was an amazing experience. These are the guys who actually set up the adult channel.
My goodness, they did this before the adult channel.
Before the adult channel, yeah.
What happened to it? The adult channel started and that was the end of HVC?
It actually dragged on for a few more years afterwards. It became like a precursor to the adult channel if you were watching on cable. Because the adult channel was broadcast on satellite, it was broadcast like a proper TV channel. So HVC was just their strange little, I don't know what it was. I never got to the bottom of it, whether there was some kind of weird tax dodge going on or what. It's because nobody was watching it, and I can't see how they made money. I think you had to subscribe to it. I think you had to subscribe for maybe an extra £5 a month on top of your cable bill. Well worth it though.
Oh, you're sorry you never saw HVC now, aren't you? Alas, we've got to end it there. What a shame. I had lots more questions. There's a brief look at them, but we're going to carry this on Patreon, and the questions I'm going to ask Dave are going to become much more searching and difficult.
Oof. Well, I'll prepare myself. Make myself comfortable.
Are you up for it, Dave?
Well, in for a penny, in for a pound.
It's very good of you, because you never ask me difficult questions, although you can if you like. If you can think of one. I'm up for it, because if you've read my book, you know I will talk.
Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? I've read your book, so what can I possibly ask you?
Let's see, shall we? We're going on to Patreon right now. If you're a subscriber, you'll know that you can join us. We'll be waiting for you. And if you're not a subscriber, this is where a link comes up. You can become a member of Patreon so easily, and all of a sudden you'll be part of our secret society. But right here now on YouTube, we have to call a halt. Join me again next week when my guest will be another writer, Ali Catterall, and he's going to be on the show for 3 reasons. First of all, he's co-directing the new film about the Scala cinema. Also, he's got a book coming out, so we want to plug that. But also, this year, he's just discovered a family he didn't know he had. So it's going to be McGee's version of, is it called Long Lost Family?
You're going to reunite them in the middle of the podcast.
Wouldn't that be lovely? Who knows? Let's find out. But for now, Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. And until next week, this is David McGillivray saying mwah. Bye-bye.